Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Getting Hammered. I am your host, Mary Catherine Ham, and we are doing something a little bit different today, as we do sometimes when Vic, my co-host, avails himself of some personal time or a vacation. We got to have somebody else in to fill that gap, and I'm very lucky to have with me today Karen Vaites, who is a friend online, but never in real life yet, someday, who covers literacy and curriculum issues. And as you guys know, I talk about education regularly. Karen is one of the folks who, during the COVID school closures, I came to trust as somebody who was willing to speak out and an expert in a specific area and very trustworthy as somebody who could give me straight information. So I thought she would be a great person to have on the show. Karen Vaites, welcome.
Thank you.
We're very glad to have you. And I would like to do a little bit about like how did you end up doing this work or becoming sort of one of the COVID school closure activists, for lack of a better term?
Gosh, becoming a COVID school closure activist just came from, maybe the through line between all of my advocacy is that I'm a research dork. And
Right.
So I think during the pandemic, my way of dealing with the anxiety of what was happening was just to read a lot.
Yeah.
And if you wanted to find the information on whether or not we could reopen schools, you could find it. We happen to be talking on a day that Dave Zweig's book is coming out, and he's writing up for all of us how very much the European nations knew and any close watchers knew about our capacity to reopen schools. So I was just reading a lot. And I'm one of those people who, once it was clear that there were all these studies saying that, yes, in fact, this was very doable, and too many regions in our country were taking a different direction, I couldn't stop talking about it for a while there. So you probably got tired of me.
No, not at all.
Because about it on the regular during that phase. But.
Not at all, because I think, unfortunately, there were too few people, and I was doing it probably in a quieter and more local way here, just mashing the button 1,000 times on the school survey. Every time they sent it, like, yes, my kids can go to school. Yes, I would be fine with it, because I was trying to send the message to other parents and other kids that, like, yes, we can do this. Because like you, I had read a lot about how Europe was dealing with this. I felt very confident and lucky that kids were going to be spared the brunt of this virus, and that if they were spared the brunt of the virus, but we did this to them nonetheless, that would be the thing that hurt them. And I think, as you reference David Zweig's book, which is called An Abundance of Caution, and he goes over all of these missteps and the damage that they've done, a couple years on, it's quite clear that that's the large part of the damage that was done to kids versus the actual virus's effects.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's been quite a ride over the last couple of years. And I want to talk to you a little bit about, well, first, what did it feel like to fight that fight? Did you find yourself, I think one of the interesting things about this discussion is, like, David Zweig and I wouldn't necessarily be on the same side of issues in the past. There's plenty of people who I was like not necessarily ideological fellow travelers with, who nonetheless I came to trust as sort of critical thinkers, like a little club of critical thinkers who were reading the literature and were reading the studies and were coming to what I thought were sober conclusions. Did you find yourself in odd company when this came about?
It was odd company, and it was also tiny company.
Yeah.
I first started saying that I thought we could look at reopening schools in the fall of 2020. I started floating some of those European studies that I was reading about. Look what they did in Germany and it all went well. Look what they did in Denmark. It all went well. Germany, not exactly a country known for being willy-nilly with data, right?
Right.
So at first it was sort of toe in the water. How do people react to this? And then I started calling more, I read more, and I started calling more openly for reopening at least elementary schools by July of 2020. And I remember posting things about it, and like 3 people would like the tweet. And then 8 people would be in your DMs, some of them teachers, saying, thank you for saying this. This is so true. Here's what's happening in my district. You should know this. And It was both. I mean, I'm not going to say there weren't really hard days, because I definitely got kicked around social media by people who believed that this was a really risky, endangering thing to do for first kids, then it was teachers, then it was grandparents. But at the same time, I was always reassured by how many people were signaling their quiet agreement with what was happening.
Right.
One of my enduring learnings of the pandemic was how much people self-silence about hard topics for understandable reasons. I understand that everybody doesn't want to be kicked around social media, but
Right.
maybe that was my biggest learning of the pandemic.
Yeah, I think back, and even for me, who was like, I went into the pandemic a public speaker, a public figure, somebody who's used to having everything I say ripped apart. And nonetheless, the social pressure of pandemic messaging and conventional wisdom was, I think, unlike anything I had experienced before, even as a public figure. And it unfortunately trickled down to anyone who chose to have a different point of view. And eventually, too late, the view prevailed that kids could go back to school. But now we have to live with the consequences of having closed the schools in many metro areas for 18 months. In some cases, that was the case around here, which is why I ended up homeschooling my kids for a year and then putting them in outside the public school district that I had always thought they would go to school in. I live in one of the gems of the American public school system before, sort of the whole country before the pandemic. And the fall from grace has been quite stunning. That's the Fairfax County school system, which is gigantic and has a lot of money, and was touting that they had electric school buses while there were no children in school or riding school buses. And it was just the picture of, frankly, a betrayal of parents here. It was quite a thing to watch, and the results in, the way students learn have been bad in this district.
Yeah, I think the pandemic was really eye-opening for a lot of people. I'm not going to say, as someone who was working in K-12 education, sort of in varying degrees, supporting districts with literacy-related work, right, and trying to help communicate to educators, often very receptive educators, all this information about how kids learn to read that has come with this movement, this science of reading movement that, I think we'll discuss vestiges of for a lot of the rest of our conversation. I'd always had a lot of optimism about the opportunities we had to improve literacy in America, and I have so many educator friends who I respect deeply. But the pandemic definitely, it was striking to me how many people, even in the K-12 education ecosystem, even literacy researchers that, could read a research paper better than I could, but the degree of self-silencing and, failure of people to get behind reopening during the pandemic was jarring for me. And then there's been this whole parent experience of being able to see via Zoom school the way that reading was taught. That's been topical. If your listeners know one thing about schools and about the literacy topics that we're going to discuss, they probably know it from a viral podcast that I'd recommend to everyone called Sold a Story.
Yes.
In which a really remarkable journalist named Emily Hanford did a phenomenal job of explaining a problem that was well known to the education community, but not well known to parents. And the springboard for her journalism for this series was parents who were watching the way reading was taught to their kindergarteners and first graders and saying, wait, this doesn't make any sense.
Interesting. And I didn't realize that came out of the pandemic instruction.
Yeah, much of the first few episodes is Emily talking with parents who were able to see that reading instruction firsthand and started asking questions about, wait, why is this thing happening? Why is that thing happening? And some of her interviews with parents, really, she interviews both parents and also educators on the way to telling this story. So it's, I give links to that podcast out away like it's, candy on Halloween.
Yes.
It's so compelling and such a good entree point to the conversation even that we're about to have today.
Yeah,
But
let me reference for it's called Sold a Story. It was released in 2022. It's been a long time. I should actually re-listen to it and brush up. And then another major story that we've talked about on this podcast in the past, which is the NAEP release this year, which is the
yeah,
National Report Card. Those are two touchstones for this conversation because the NAEP numbers largely not good, showed persistent losses for kids in reading and math all over the country, but worse for those, as many predicted while we were protesting the school closings, that it would be worse for those who had less to begin with, right? And so those are two touchstones for folks. I just mentioned them because we have mentioned them on the podcast before. But tell me about Sold a Story and what, in your view, obviously you'd been following this before that bit of journalism was released. What was this form of instruction that caught on? And it's, if I, tell me if I'm mischaracterizing it, but it feels sort of like a pedagogical trend that caught on that then could not be cleared from the system, even though we knew that it wasn't working. Is that a fair characterization?
yeah, it's one of those things that's hard to describe because a form of teaching reading caught on that relied really heavily on kids working with their own books and doing what's described as independent reading, where students are picking books and starting to engage with books, starting in kindergarten before they can read, and also is encouraging kids to, rather than encouraging children to sound out words and rather than teaching kids the code of the English language and teaching children that, if you see the letters C and H next to each other, that's CH, it makes the ch sound. And
Right.
if you see it at the beginning of the word, here are some, it sounds like this in these words. And if you give kids that code and you teach children the 42 different, sounds in the letter sound correspondences in the English language, you can empower kids to break down new words when they
Right.
encounter them. That would be the teaching of phonics and phonemic awareness. And that is what is decidedly recommended by the preponderance of the evidence. And we've known this for years. But a form of teaching called balanced literacy caught on that more or less in these balanced literacy curricula bypassed that approach. And kids were in that approach being encouraged to kind of piece it together themselves. And if they encountered a word that they didn't know or they couldn't break down, they could just skip that word, or they could look at the picture to try to figure out what the word was, and effectively was coaching kids to guess rather than actually properly read words and break down new words. That's an oversimplification in some ways, really, of what we need to do in early literacy, but it was one core problem of many with the way that reading was being taught in a lot of schools. And Emily tells this story better in, a 6-episode podcast than I can in a 60-second debrief.
Right.
So I do encourage folks to give it a listen. But basically, there's no question with educators having listened to this podcast, we've had lots of educators coming out of the woodwork to say, you know what, I've been teaching reading wrong for my whole career, and I'm figuring this out. So the education system is amidst a transition. Emily's podcast is just one reason, but there are a couple other things that we'll talk about, some of the states that are gaining in literacy right now. And
yes, there is good news.
We will
get to that. Yeah, I know it's oversimplified, but what were the results of teaching reading wrong? I mean, for a mom, so I'm a mom of school-age kids. So for me, I would have sent them to my public school and not really thought through how that was taught. I would have assumed that phonics was still happening because, that's what we did, and probably wouldn't have looked too deeply into it. And, what were the results for kids because of this?
So one thing we know is that if you look at the K-12 curriculum, it's expected that you're going to spend kindergarten and first grade really immersing in this, learning to read these reading foundations. And by second grade, you're probably going to still be deepening those foundations. We still have some kids that are piecing that together in second grade, even with strong curriculum that is introducing these letter sound correspondences. But by the time you get to third grade, overall, the curriculum's going to presume that you've figured out how to read and and
Right.
process new words when you encounter them. So the curriculum shifts into a mode where suddenly you're engaging with texts every day. And that's not just in the English language arts part of the curriculum, your history curriculum,
Right.
in math, your word problems. The whole system is set up to expect that you've basically figured that out. And those years are even described sometimes in shorthand as there are the learn to read years, and then you go in from third grade on into the reading to learn years.
Right.
So children that enter third grade without having those foundations, there's in a typical school system, there isn't a lot set up to catch those kids and remediate. And honestly, it makes perfect sense that you would, from third grade on, really go to be deepening kids' knowledge and getting them into work with novels and texts. What we really want is we want the foundations to be built so well in K2 with so many good diagnostics to make sure that kids are moving on, that in fact, it all works. And we are only passing on to third grade kids that are not struggling. But we're really even dealing with a generation right now of children that were passed on without those skills.
Right.
We have teachers teaching eighth graders, teaching high schoolers saying, wow, now that there's this national discussion about this issue, I'm realizing I have kids that actually can't decode words effectively enough, and they're high schoolers.
Yeah.
So as a system, K-12 education is having to kind of retrench around how do we make sure that we pass some kids through that didn't have these skills. Now what?
Around what year did this become sort of the thing?
Hanford's work started bringing awareness to all of this about 6 years ago. She put out some also very highly recommended by me single episode podcasts, starting with one called Hard Words, again, about 6 years ago. So her reporting has really helped to break this issue through. But if you talk to many literacy experts deep in the literacy community, they'll say, we've been talking about this for 30 years.
Okay.
We've been trying to convince people to stop using these curricula that have now been basically unmasked as weak for 15 years. So this is one of those longstanding issues that is finally coming into public consciousness.
Well, and one hopes that the National Report Card and these somewhat alarming numbers in some cases would continue that conversation. But the good news that I referenced, now that we've depressed everybody for the first part of the podcast, the good news is that there were some promising spots in the National Report Card, though they were, not a ton of them. There does seem to be a pattern, and you have been writing about it, sort of terming it it's termed the Southern Surge. Among a handful of Southern states, Louisiana, I think first among them in its gains. A little counterintuitive. I'm from the South, so I'm allowed to say it. Like, I went to school in Georgia and was born in Alabama. Like, we're a bit of a literacy punchline sometimes, particularly maybe Mississippi and Alabama. And that is changing. Can you tell me a little bit about how this came to be? Maybe start with Louisiana, since I believe it's the one that actually saw perhaps the most gains among the handful of states that improved.
Sure. So I'll start with the two states that have made the biggest gains in the last decade and a half, and that would be Louisiana and Mississippi. Those two states, every state is expected to do its annual state assessments, and each state has its own assessment, but there is this national exam called the NAEP that is administered every 2 years. So we've been watching every 2 years who's gaining, who's falling behind on the NAEP. And just to give people one last dose of depressing news before we shoot, good story.
It's okay.
We can actually talk now about a decade-long decline in reading outcomes on the NAEP because, and that's important to say because these issues about how reading is taught and how we're monitoring that and how we're taking action on it aren't new with the pandemic. I think many people even hear the negative results and think, wow, the pandemic was hard on kids, which is absolutely true. The decline since 2019, the last time the NAEP was administered before the pandemic, are grim. But actually the decline started about 5 years before that. So we all need to get to the bottom of why.
Right.
But more importantly, for our conversation now, because we want to, we've as a nation got to march out of this. And so who's figured out the answers? Well, Mississippi and Louisiana did a set of things over the last decade and a half that they took the same reform efforts. They did them in slightly different orders. So we even have two slightly different models for how you go ahead and improve reading outcomes in your state. But what was really animating for them, frankly, was being at the bottom. If you go back to 2011, Mississippi and Louisiana were 49 and 50 in reading outcomes, respectively. And that was animating. And suddenly you had states bring in really dynamic state leaders who were not going to stand for, kind of milquetoast reform. They came in with really important and kind of dramatic plans. They had some tailwinds. In Mississippi, there's a gentleman named Jim Barksdale who gave $100 million to start something called the Barksdale Reading Institute. And that institute started to catalyze some reform opportunities and push strong legislation. And they took a more legislated route at the outset. In Louisiana, a really strong leader took advantage of the Common Core reforms. And when the Common Core state standards came in, those were at a national level. And from anybody in the literacy community, I think anybody would say, yeah, those were better standards than we had before.
Right.
And the Louisiana team leveraged that as an opportunity to say, okay, this is a moment of change in how we're supposed to be teaching reading and math. So let's really get after this. And they took a different approach that centered on, let's give schools excellent curriculum that really do this work well, and took a slightly different set of approaches. At this point, both Mississippi and Louisiana have done a set of the same things.
Right.
They've invested in teacher training. So they've really trained their teachers on how students learn to read. They've invested in much better curriculum that is comprehensive and better aligned to what we know works to support reading development. They have invested in coaching and nurtured sort of better in-school coaching by leaders that really, they've done it differently, but they've really gotten into schools with instructional leaders to help coach this work on. They also have both put in laws that do mandate retention of students who aren't successful at the end of that third grade benchmark. So they're not passing on kids who can't read into fourth grade to destine them to struggle. That was one of those policies that 5 years ago I really had some struggle with, because it's tough to think about retaining a third grader. But to be honest, what it seems to have done is it really motivates the adults to pull out all the stops to make success happen by third grade. So I've even changed my position on that.
That's very interesting, because I remember, and I don't know if I'm mischaracterizing this, but when I was a kid, retention was like kind of a normal thing, particularly in early grades. It wasn't really. Now, I came from a very impoverished city school district, public school, and it was sort of a normal thing. And then it went out of fashion at some point, and the idea was that you shouldn't do that to kids and sort of separate them from their peers and that kind of thing. So it's interesting to me that this is like, not that it's the cornerstone of this, but it is part of it for lighting a fire under people.
It's definitely a part of it. And when you talk to people who are close to the ground, they say what this really does is it just catalyzes adults. It makes all of the adults, both the educators, but also the parents, it really makes everyone come together when a child is not on track to meet that success threshold. And it has brought some creative programming into the ecosystem. We'll talk about Alabama in a minute, but we've just seen districts and states, again, pulling out all the stops, getting new tutoring programs in place. So I'm completely prepared to say that is absolutely a part of what's making these states so successful.
Now, these states were at 49 and 50 before. Is there an analogous ranking at this point for where they are?
Yeah. So if they started from the bottom, at this point, now I'm going to talk mostly about these fourth grade reading outcomes, and we can talk about eighth grade too. But at this point, Mississippi ranks 9th in the nation for fourth grade reading proficiency. And it is, if you look at reading proficiency for underprivileged children, which many of us think is a very strong measure because you start to take out the effect of both kind of parent support and what did kids come into school with from a success criteria perspective? Did they come with sort of stronger vocabulary or early reading skills? You take that out and it's a better measure of what did the schools deliver if we're looking at how did a school...
Versus a home, right.
We're taking out the effect of at-home tutoring. So if we look at the effect for underprivileged children, at this point, Mississippi is number one in the country for success in fourth grade reading proficiency for at least privileged children. And that is such a bold statement.
wild.
The idea that Mississippi is outperforming everyone in the country for underprivileged readers, right up through Massachusetts and states that we've considered the gold standard all these years, that has to compel our attention.
Yeah, that's wild and inspiring and so nice to see. And presumably these curricula and these shifts are available pretty easily to other states. I don't want to minimize how hard it is to put reforms in, but we know what works at this point, correct? It's not really a giant debate.
Yeah, it's not a particularly, I mean, there are, of course, debates about the nuances of anything, but
Right.
from a big picture perspective, what are the fundamentals of literacy success? It's really not widely debated. At this point, it's just a question of what are the best mechanisms to make sure that schools all have these same practices consistently happening in their grades, and how do we get a win to win, whether that's happening or not.
And perhaps the way to animate other states is to be like, do you want to get beat by Mississippi? Because that's what's happening right now.
Well, 100%. And this is why. So the Mississippi story, Mississippi started showing up as a gainer on the NAEP, like growing and growing and growing. So we've been watching Mississippi for a few NAEP cycles in a row. And when Mississippi first we started seeing the evidence it was rising, this term came out, the Mississippi Miracle, which, comes with its share of, as you said, you're from the South, you can say it, but
Yeah.
this share of like, really, Mississippi? And of course, people that didn't like the reforms that it were doing were looking for excuses. It's a data anomaly because they're retaining third graders. It's
Right.
People looked for any reason to avoid the fact that this was real. And now that we have Louisiana with similar reforms, again, done a little differently, turning up, and Louisiana is now tied for 14th for reading proficiency, up from being in that number 50 slot.
Right.
So we've got Louisiana that goes from 50 to 14. Louisiana is number 2 for its success with its underprivileged fourth grade readers.
Wow.
So now we've got these 2 case studies, and on their heels, we have 2 more states.
Okay.
Tennessee, starting about 6 years ago, put in reforms that are very, very similar to Louisiana, almost like a Louisiana plus Mississippi, but we did it faster because we knew what worked. So
Right.
Tennessee pioneered a very smart set of reforms about 6 years ago. Tennessee has also moved up. Tennessee is now in the 14th position, tied with Louisiana for overall fourth grade proficiency. And if you look at its march upward on its state outcomes, they have these powerful gains in every assessed grade. Alabama has also started showing up as a gainer on the NAEP. They're almost the new kid on the block. They started their reforms about 5 years ago. They almost carbon copied the Mississippi model, and they're showing gains.
Nice.
And to me, that's the story.
Right.
I love Mississippi's story by itself. I love Louisiana's story by itself. Once we've got 4 states, that's a pattern, that's a trend, and it proves that what was happening in Mississippi, what happened in Louisiana, these aren't anomalies.
Yeah.
These are models. And the real question is, how do we get every other state to follow?
Well, it's also somewhat hopeful that you can take steps 6 years ago, 5 years ago, and see progress that is this marked that quickly. Because, and this is not to discount the fact that those 5 years of change and the time before that, those students still would suffer from various losses during that time. But man, that's like a shorter timeline than I would imagine for putting something in, seeing changes on the ground, and makes me hopeful for kids who are young at this point in many states where things could go in a different direction. Tell me about, I know you've written a bit about how this is being covered, and I'm basically aware of it because I follow you. And I don't think it's a national news story when it seems, as I keep saying inspiring, it seems inspiring that this is a huge problem. It can change the quality of life and education for students from, their young years on into adulthood. You're making gains with challenging populations, with people who do not have intense resources or coaching at home. It's all the things we want. And yet it is not being covered, even in the wake of this national report card and in the wake of COVID and looking for new solutions. To my mind, I'm not seeing it as much as I would like to.
No, it's the short answer is it really isn't being covered, not with any consistency and not by national media. So I can point you to a couple of examples in education specific publications. It's not a completely untold story. And to be fair, the Mississippi story has more traction and had been covered before this NAEP cycle, as we started to allude to. But again, many people were doing that whole, that bias, who wants to be like Mississippi, was maybe a little too strong. So
the Mississippi mirage, because that can't be correct.
Exactly. So the fact that we now have this pattern and multiple states, and we have a playbook, these states give us a playbook, that hasn't been covered very well. And you've seen in social media and in some things I've written, I've been theorizing and speculating. And I don't know that I can give you good answers for why it hasn't been well covered, but I am grateful to you for taking the time with me to talk about it. This is how we start, right? Who knows what journalists will listen to this. One of my leading theories for why it's not getting covered is a little implicit in this conversation. It's like a gory, wonky topic, right? To really get under the hood here. Neither of these states did just one quick thing. They did multi-layered reforms. So to really get into those weeds is a little challenging for journalists. I would be the first to say so. I had to spend years in this space to really understand the story myself. So there's that. But I really hope we can get more attention here, because the opportunity is so large. And even in America, in these fractured times, I would like to think this is the sort of story that we can get everyone to rally around.
Yeah, it is the hope that that we still have a system that, I mean, even if it's just state by state, which I think is an easier thing to bite off, that you see something that's obviously working and people can come together and go, we should do the thing that's obviously working. What is the other end of the spectrum on the NAEP and what it has shown in other states? I feel like there were a couple of, I'm going to refer to them in the political sense, of the blue wall, sort of like Minnesota, Wisconsin, maybe, that showed some very bad results. What is the other end of the spectrum here?
Yeah, this was just plain a really grim NAEP cycle. People talk about it as, some of the worst outcomes we've seen across literacy and math in 20 years. We saw the lowest reading outcomes for 8th graders in reading that we'd seen since, the NAEP exam kicked off. Like, it was just not good.
Yeah.
So I, like you, I don't like to just talk about the problem. I prefer to talk about solutions. So it's what I would want people who are listening to hear is that there are these regions that have figured out the answers. And there's another layer that I want people to understand, which is many other states have taken some form of action, but it's not necessarily the action that is going to lead to them turning into Mississippi or Louisiana tomorrow.
Right.
So because of this, we actually kicked off talking about some of this journalism, and in part because Emily Hanford's journalism and some related journalism has helped many people realize, hey, we've got a problem with how we teach reading. We've also seen a science of reading legislation movement. In fact, between 2019 and 2022, 45 states passed some form of reading legislation.
Okay.
The truth is, it's not easy to legislate what happens in classrooms. And so I think many of us in the space have wondered, well, how effective will this be? And the answer is always, it will be as effective as how well the rubber meets the road.
Right.
So legislation was a factor in each of the Southern surge states along the way. I'm not saying that can't be a catalyst, but what you really needed in those states was you needed the State Department of Education to show up with a strong and multi-layered plan. What worries me most?
One of the things, I hate to break it on you, one of the things you note too that I noticed in reading about this is that as these various Southern states adopted new attempts at this basic rubric, one of the things they did was, I believe it was Tennessee, maybe cut down on the number of hours of teacher training, which just like not that it's less quality, But if you can say to teachers, okay, it's not going to be 150 of your extra hours, it's going to be 60 of your extra hours, that seems to me like a sort of optimization that's being learned as we go.
Oh, yeah. Definitely optimization as we go. In fact, Mississippi itself optimized along the way. So the detail you're alluding to, Mississippi started training its teachers with a 150-hour training called letters training.
Right.
It's very good training, but it's really, in 150 hours, you're going to go very deep on how kids learn to read. The open question has been, is 150 hours the right number? Because not only, understandably, if I'm going to teach you about something and ask a lot of your time, it's going to take longer to get all teachers trained if we take that much time per teacher. Right. Mississippi itself changed a few years ago and moved to a 45-hour training. And these 4 Southern Surge states have all gone with trainings that are in that 45 to 50-hour sweet spot and then given teachers good curriculum. But we still see states around the country that think that this 150-hour training is the gold standard because Mississippi did it. So back to the devil being in the details.
Yeah.
We need other states to be really reading into the nuances of what these 4 states got right. And I think my biggest fear right now is that in a number of states, legislators and the Department of Education will be able to say, oh, yeah, we passed this legislation, we're making this change or that change, but they're actually doing 2 of the 5 things that the Southern Surge states did, and they're doing it at a shallowness level where we're not going to see that forward progress. We can frankly just do some math here and say 45 states passed legislation, but we're only talking about 4 states that have made these gains. So,
right, exactly.
Like if you love your state leaders and you love your kids, we need to send this Southern Surge playbook to all of these state leaders to make sure that we're all kind of getting there faster.
By the way, the sentence, the exclamatory, we passed this legislation, is one of my least favorite sentences in government because, and it's frankly the reason that I got involved in politics and policy in the first place, is that as a kid, I looked around me and was like, okay, you guys are doing things and checking boxes, but I don't think they're doing the things that you say you're doing, right? You can't just call legislation Make Things Better Act and then you have magically made things better. You actually do have to do the stuff on the ground. And it's encouraging to see that some states have figured out how to do that. Is there a sort of a nonprofit or research world and community that is tracking what each of these 45 states is doing on the ground and how that differs from the southern states? Is that something people are putting resources into?
Yeah, I wish I had a better answer, but there's definitely no one answer. In fact, I would probably have to rattle off 10 different organizations to even send you in a direction for what to watch.
Right.
So no, I mean, one of the unfortunate realities about K-12 education is that as important as it is to people, it's not the best covered subject in the media on a good day. And so it really does fall to, advocacy organizations, it falls to K-12 researchers, and it falls to invested parents and parent groups to be paying attention to those details.
Yeah. It has always struck me as strange that in national politics, and I think it really came to a head during the COVID school closures, how little attention is given to K through 12 education. You'll get like one debate question in the presidential race per 3 debates, right? And then everybody can just kind of do their normal pablum on either side. And it doesn't really get to what people are worried about. I think, an exception, of course, was the Virginia governor's race in 2021 that here, got Glenn Youngkin, Republican, ended up winning, upsetting in this purple state Democrat Terry McAuliffe. But it really centered on school issues. But it took schools being closed for 18 months for that to be the issue. And I just feel like there's so much cachet in mom voters that it seems like more than just lip service should be given to this, certainly on a state-by-state basis. If you're running for Senate in Michigan, you should be talking about this.
I think that's right. But at the same time, there's something that's described in education as the Lake Wobegon effect, where if you look at national polls, in fact, in the last handful of years, in national polls, Americans say they are increasingly concerned about education.
Right.
And, our education, people's estimation of it is going down year by year. But if you look at surveys of how they feel about their local school system, they tend to give a pretty positive survey result. Is that because their local school system is awesome? Actually, if they really got under the hood about how reading is taught, about what the outcomes look like, about any number of issues, people might actually be more animated about it. But I think that a lot of if you go back to this issue of people do vote on kitchen table issues, we may believe as a nation that our education system writ large isn't great. But if I think that my local school system has figured it out, it doesn't turn into a kitchen table issue for me.
Right.
So I think the disconnect is a bit there. And it's all the more reason that we need journalists like Emily Hanford. We need more discourse like this to help people know how to look under the hood, to even see, is my local school system really crushing it? Or actually, is that my perception because I moved to this area? I think you get the selection effect. Like, this
and
must
again,
be good because I moved here for them, right?
Well, and that's what happened in my area, right? Is there's a million families here who are here because the school system was great, and actually, I think it was great at some point, right? Yeah. And it has fallen off dramatically. But I would have pre-pandemic likely sent my kids to the public school and never looked under the hood much. I mean, maybe a little, but I would trust it to sort of be on medium autopilot for me. And the pandemic made me much more engaged. I actually ended up teaching both of my kids to read by accident because we were here and doing that. And we'll end on sort of this, unless I've missed anything you want to hit, but we'll end on this slightly more uplifting thought, because I would love you to tell me a little bit about this. When I taught my kids to read, basically just by reading to each other for hours per day. It's like, I don't know how to do homeschool, so I'm going to read to you and you're going to read to me. That was the idea. And it worked out great. And I did a little bit of phonics research and a little bit of help with them. But in doing that, it opened up the possibility to do so much more in every other subject. So I didn't know how to do homeschool, but once they had learned to read and liked to read, everything else became so much more available to us. Can you talk a little bit about that and the richness that it adds to other skills?
Yeah, well, one of the things that, back to kind of being a data dork, one of the interesting things that we're seeing in the Southern surge states, and it hasn't been analyzed enough for me to say it's absolutely causal, but we're watching their math outcomes go up, and they don't seem to have had like a big math initiative consistently. So what we think we're seeing is that nice tailwind of, if you can read successfully, you can be more successful with math problem. Mm-hmm. Back to this read to learn phase, the best way to acquire new vocabulary is by reading.
Right.
And you're reading along and you encounter this new word and you know enough to be dangerous and you can break down the word. So once we talk about something called the Matthew effect, where the rich get richer, as soon as you have reading skills, your ability to keep acquiring new knowledge and new vocabulary and new skills, new reading stamina through reading goes up dramatically. So I would absolutely leave your readers, or your listeners, with the takeaway that, the most important thing you can do for your kids is make sure that they have reading success by the end of second grade. There are many schools that send those signals that, oh, your first grader is struggling. He or she, often it's he, is just a slow developer. It will come together. And I think parents need to completely ignore that message, question that message, and do what the Southern states do, pull out all the stops to get kids reading by second grade. I'll close by telling your listeners, there's a wonderful book if you're concerned about your kids' early reading skills and that phonics and decoding work, called Teach Your Kids to Read in 100 Easy Lessons.
Nice. I believe I have that book. That was part of my plan. Look, I just stumbled on it.
This book is gold. Parents rave about it in social media. And it really is like 100 100 simple things that a parent can do. It's written for parents. So when in doubt, grab that book if you have any concerns. And do know that, as you alluded to before, we have, as a, the research community has figured out what it takes. Clearly some states have figured out what it takes. And now it's on the rest of us to give that work more of a push in new places like mine.
Yeah. On one hand, it's a good problem to have, that there is a solution and more people need to know about the solution. It doesn't always work that way so smoothly in politics and in curriculum, but it's good to know that there is something that's working. Thank you so much for being with us, Karen Vaites. I am going to recommend to everybody not just that book, but Sold a Story, which is worth listening to. And then also at Karen Vaites. She is at Karen Vaites. Is that correct?
That's right.
Vaites. And she writes a Substack called School Yourself, which I think is a great name. So look her up, follow her. And I think staying on top of this kind of thing and just like having it on your radar, even if you're just a mom who's basically interested in education, is important, because then you can keep track of what's going on in your state and you can send signals to the right people that I care about this. And I want this to happen for a bunch of kids so that the kids can be reading and having good vocabularies, and these scores can go up. I am hopeful thanks to seeing some of this.
I'm hopeful too.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being with us. This has been Getting Hammered. Thank you for getting hammered responsibly with us. This has been a Nebulous Media podcast.